Okay, here we have graphing a trig function where we're going to have all four things being changed. The amplitude, period, phase shift, and vertical shift are all going to be happening. So if you have the packet, or not really packet, but stapled thing that says 14.2 translations of trig functions, worksheet number 2, if you got this for homework, this is problem number 3 on that. So if you need some examples with that, but this includes all four things will be changed. So let's identify what's going on first before we graph. Amplitude's the number in front, so amplitude is going to be a 2, and it's going to be negative. It's going to be flipped upside down. So amplitude is the absolute value of the distance between the midline and then the maximum point or the minimum point. So technically the amplitude is just going to be 2, but know that it's going to be negative. Okay, so we'll just put negative here. So it's really 2, but I want you to make sure you know that it's going to be flipped. Okay, period. I'm going to set this stuff with my x, stuff with my theta, equal to the normal period length of sine, which is 2 pi. So 1/2 x equals 2 pi, normal period length. So to solve for x, I times 2. So my normal period length, or my new period length here is going to be 4 pi. That's my period. Okay. Next we have the phase shift. There's something right here, but it's not just going to be negative pi over 4. Okay, we're going to set the whole parentheses equal to 0. When we have a period change and a phase shift, it is not just the normal h value. Okay, so make sure you don't get that wrong. Set the whole parentheses equal to 0 and you're going to solve for x or solve for theta. Okay, so I'm going to subtract pi over 2, or pi over 4. Alright, so to get rid of this half, I'm going to times by 2. So it's really like 2 over 1. A lot of us have been struggling with that as well. We're not so great with fractions. So we have x equals, or my new phase shift is going to be negative pi over 2 is my new phase shift. Okay? Negative pi over 2, which means to the left, pi over 2. Okay? Lastly, my vertical shift is this end point right here is going to be a +1. So we'll write that right here is my vertical shift. Okay, so we have all four things are being changed. So first thing we're going to deal with is we're going to start labeling at the phase shift. Okay, so it was moved to the left. So instead of starting at 0, I'm going to move and have this first thing be negative pi over 2. We move to the left, so instead of 0, it's moved back to the left, pi over 2 amount. So to find the end, where my cycle ends, I'm going to take my phase shift plus the period. Now be careful, the period was different in this one. My phase shift is negative pi over 2. My new period was 4 pi. So let's change that into a fraction. 8 pi over 2 is the same as 4 pi. So this is going to be 7 pi over 2 is my end, is where the cycle would end. Okay? So when it's phase shift and a period change, your ending point is going to be different. So this is going to be 7 pi over 2. Okay? The distance between the start and the end needs to be the period length. So that is a distance of 4 pi. So make sure you're being careful when both the period and the phase shift are different. Okay? So to find the intervals in between, we've said you can average them. Okay? Forget about the pi. So to find the intervals, you're going to average. Okay, so we have negative pi over 2, I'm just going to call it negative 1/2, and we'll stick the pi back in later. Plus, the end is 7 pi over 2, or just 7 over 2. Okay? If I add those together, you get 6 over 2, which is really 3, right? 6 divided by 2 is 3. So that's, when I add them together, I need to divide my 3 by 2, which gives me 3 over 2. Okay? So we said we just put a pi back in there, so my middle interval is going to be 3 pi over 2. So if you're not sure, if you're struggling with these fractions, take the average of them. Forget about the pi, because they're all going to have pi, because these are in radians. So take the average of the first and the end. You could do that same thing here. From this point to this point, average them together to find the next thing in the middle. It's going to be pi over 2. And then the last one would be 5 pi over 2. Okay, so we have taken care of the period and the phase shift in our labeling right here. Next thing that we're going to do is the amplitude. Okay, so I'm going to talk about my y-axis here now. So this will be at positive 2 and negative 2. This is getting a little bit messy. Let's do it in purple. Positive 2 and negative 2. Okay, so now we have the regular sine graph. We're going to address the amplitude. So normally it's at 0, 0. 0 times negative 2 stays there. Normally it's at positive 1 is the next spot. 1 times negative 2 is going to actually be down here. Right? It should be flipped over. So instead of going up first, it should go down. This is good. The next point is normally 3 pi over 2 and 0. 0 times 2 is up here. Next one is normally at 0 again. Whoa. Let me redo that. Didn't think through it. Okay. So normally we're at 0. Good. Down. Okay, so we got to go back one. That one was not right. Okay, so next we're normally at 0. Right here. 0 times negative 2 stays at 0. Sorry about that. Next one we are typically down. You know what? It might help if I draw in the original one. So normally we're like this. And like that. Okay, so that's the normal sine curve. I'm going to do my purple is with the amplitude change. So normally I'm down at negative 1 here at 5 pi over 2. Negative 1 times negative 2 becomes up at positive 2. Last point where my cycle ends, I'm at 0. 0 times negative 2 stays at 0. So I'm going to also do a dashed line here. This is with my amplitude in effect. But the last thing is my phase shift. I did not move it up 1 yet. Okay, so let me see if I can pick, we all use red. What color should I use? Let's do this kind of darker green maybe. Okay, so get out of there. Alright, so now last thing, this is going to be the last thing we do is the vertical shift, and I'd suggest that doing the vertical shift at the end every time. So everything's going to have to be moved up 1 unit. So here is going to become a 3. This is 1, negative 2. It's got to be a negative 1 right here. And so all my purple points are going to be moved up 1. So over here, move this one up, and now it's at negative 1. Move this one up, it's at positive 1. This up is at positive 3. This up is at positive 1. And I'm going to connect my green, my dark green dots. Okay? So that should be our graph there. The most important thing is probably the intervals. That's the more difficult part. I think the amplitude and the vertical shift aren't as bad to figure out. So making sure that you start, when there's a phase shift, start labeling at the phase shift, plus to find the end, you're going to do the phase shift plus the period length. And then finding the intervals, you can just average them. Okay, so this is problem number 3 if you have that worksheet packet.